down. But Washington is still hoping to achieve the North's denuclearization before the end of President Donald Trump's first term in office. We'll have an expert in the studio later to dissect the developments. But first, let's turn to our Kim Mo-gyan at Arirang's News Center for a look at the day's headlines. Mo-gyan.
Yes, Minji. Starting off at the top office, a major cabinet reshuffle took place this morning as President Moon Jae-in nominated 7 new ministers. Our Blue House correspondent Hwang Ho-jun reports.
7 new ministers, including the new person in charge of Seoul's affairs with North Korea, were nominated on Friday morning. The Blue House called them qualified people who will bring substantial results.
As President Moon is now entering the second half of his term, the latest cabinet reshuffle shows how much he stresses the importance of tangible accomplishments for the public, and to that end, the necessity of hiring qualified personnel with a proven track record.
President Moon nominated Kim Chol, who has served as the head of the Korea Institute for National Unification, to replace the outgoing unification minister Cho Myung-gyun. The Blue House said Kim is known for his vast experience in inter-Korean economic cooperation and North Korean nuclear issues. Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology professor Cho Dong-ho was nominated as the new Minister of Science, ICT and Future Planning for his expertise in the field. For the Culture, Sports and Tourism Minister, the president chose Park Yang-woo, who served as vice minister for that ministry during the Roh Moo-hyun administration. The new Land, Infrastructure and Transport Minister will be Choi Jong-ho, who served as the vice minister during the Park Geun-hye administration. And for the Ministry for Oceans and Fisheries, Moon Sung-hyuk, a professor at World Maritime University, was selected. He also has experience as a first mate at Hyundai Merchant Marine. 2 4-term lawmakers were also nominated to be a part of President Moon's new cabinet. Park Young-sun, of the ruling Democratic Party of Korea, was nominated as the new Minister of SMEs and Startups, and Jin Young, also from the ruling party, was chosen as the new Minister of Interior and Safety. With Thursday's reshuffle, 4 of the lawmakers turned ministers are expected to return to the party to run in the general elections next year. The Blue House said the nominees all passed the government's so-called 7 irregularities test, which bars those who have been involved in either military service evasion, real estate speculation, tax fraud, false residence registration, academic plagiarism, drunk driving, or sexual misconduct. The nominees will go through a parliamentary confirmation hearing before taking up their positions. Hwang Ho-jun, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in is embarking on a trip to 3 ASEAN countries next week. His focus will be on strengthening Korea's cooperation with Southeast Asia as part of his new Southern policy. Shin Se-min reports.
The president's first overseas trip of the year begins with Southeast Asian nations. Over a 1-week period starting from Sunday, March 10th, the president will be traveling to Brunei, Malaysia, and Cambodia with hopes of boosting ties with ASEAN member states in line with the South Korean leader's new Southern policy.
The president's overseas trip next week will be an opportunity to accelerate the new Southern policy and diversify Korea's trade market and network of global production that's been concentrated in the U.S. and China.
From the 10th of March until the 12th, the president will be in Brunei for a sit-down with Sultan Hassan al Bolkiah and a state dinner. The president is expected to broaden existing cooperation on energy and infrastructure while working to develop Brunei's patent system. And the president could also lay the groundwork for a successful hosting of the South Korea-ASEAN summit scheduled for the end of this year. The president's next stop is Malaysia, the first visit to the country by a South Korean leader in 9 years. He will be attending an official welcoming ceremony and a state banquet upon his arrival. It is expected that the leader will work on upgrading their current relations to a more future-oriented partnership and cooperate on future technologies such as artificial intelligence and smart cities. And the president will wrap up his 3-nation tour in Cambodia, where he will be greeted by King Norodom Sihamoni, the prime minister, and Korean nationals living in the country. During his stay there, the president will work on expanding bilateral ties in infrastructure, finance, and agriculture. The president's pivot to ASEAN is looking to get a boost through the week-long overseas visit. It is hoped the trip will be an opportunity to lay the foundation for constructive bilateral and multilateral meetings lined up this year, such as the South Korea ASEAN Summit and the first Korea-Mekong Summit. 신세민, Arirang News.
South Korea's top nuclear envoy Lee Do-hun says the U.S. is ready to engage in dialogue with North Korea. He arrived in Seoul after discussing the outcome of the second North Korea-U.S. summit with his counterpart Stephen Biegun in Washington. Upon his arrival, he told reporters that South Korea and the U.S. had good talks. He also said the U.S. firmly believes the Hanoi summit was productive and constructive. South Korea posted a current account surplus for the 81st month in a row in January, but that figure shrank to its smallest in 9 months. Kim Hae-sung has the story.
Korea posted a current account surplus of $2.8 billion in January. That's about $2 billion lower than December and also the smallest monthly surplus since April last year when it hit a 6-year low of $1.7 billion. The Bank of Korea attributed the fall to smaller goods account surplus, which narrowed to an 11-month low of $5.6 billion, with exports falling over 5% on year to $49 billion, posting 2 consecutive months of contraction. Semiconductor exports, which accounted for a fifth of Korea's total exports in 2018, dropped over 22% on year in January on decreasing global demand. Petrochemical goods exports also dropped around 5% from the same period last year. By region, exports to China dropped near 20% and exports to the Middle East dropped by 27% on slowing demand. Imports decreased slightly by 2%. The services account deficit, however, narrowed to $3.6 billion from $4.4 billion a year earlier. The central bank said both the transport account deficit and travel account deficit had decreased. In the travel account, the number of Chinese and Japanese visitors to Korea soared into double digits, helping bring the travel account deficit below the $2 billion mark. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
Foreign direct investment by Korean companies reached a yearly record high of nearly $50 billion last year. Data released by the Ministry of Economy and Finance on Friday shows that combined overseas investment rose by nearly 12% from the previous year to around $49.8 billion as of the end of last year. Steep rises were seen in the manufacturing sector, particularly in the areas related to semiconductor facility investment, mainly in China and Vietnam. It was followed by investment related to the finance and insurance sectors. By region, Asia saw the most investment, followed by Europe and North America. I'm Kim Mo-gyun, and those are your news headlines at this hour.
It's been a week since the second North Korea-U.S. summit, and we're continuing to hear various behind-the-scenes stories from the summit. And in the latest development, a senior U.S. official says Washington still hopes to achieve the North's denuclearization over the coming years. Lee Ji-won has more.
The U.S. believes the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea is still achievable before the end of President Trump's first term in office, which is January 2021. A senior State Department official told reporters Thursday that the U.S. has discussed the timeline, and at this point, Washington believes there's sufficient time to achieve this. The official added denuclearization includes taking out all the key parts of the North's nuclear fuel cycle, all of the fissile material, nuclear warheads, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and permanently freezing any other weapons of mass destruction, including chemical and biological. The official also discussed sanctions on the North, saying they will remain in place, but they could get tougher should President Trump choose to strengthen them. On the inter-Korean projects, the official said the U.S. is not considering giving exemptions. This is likely on the reopening of the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the resumption of South Korean tours to the North's Kumgangsan Mountain, which the South has been pushing to resume while abiding by international sanctions. On recent reports about activity at the North's Dongchangri missile facility, the official said the Trump administration is still trying to determine exactly what North Korea is doing, but did not necessarily agree with those who say the activity is a sign of North Korea's discontent following the Hanoi summit. Though careful not to downplay the concerns, the official also said the Seohae facility is not a critical part of North Korea's nuclear infrastructure, but it does need to be dismantled during the denuclearization process. As the tug-of-war between North Korea and the U.S. is likely to continue for a while, the official said it's now up to the North, to some extent, to decide to engage on the expectations of its denuclearization. 이지원, Arirang News.
And for more, Dr. YoungHan, a research fellow from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, joins us in the studio today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So like we just heard, the U.S. believes that complete denuclearization of North Korea is possible before the end of President Donald Trump's first term in office. So we have just about under 2 years left now. So the U.S. says it's discussed a timeline, and Washington is hopeful that it's achieved. Now, at the same time, the U.S. official also touches upon sanctions and says it could be strengthened if President Donald Trump decides to strengthen them. What's your take?
Well, clearly, after the breakdown of talks in Hanoi last week, North Korea and the United States, they are not in the most favorable situation when it comes to continuing the dialogue. Clearly, the Hanoi summit revealed there are fundamental differences between the two sides, and then we need more dialogue between the two sides so to shrink the gap in their respective positions. So far, there are talks of sanctions being increased, or North Korea going back to carrying out provocations. But in truth, neither side has really taken decisive action in either direction. So these are for now our talks. So we are talking about hypotheticals here. So hopefully the two sides are going to continue talking before resorting to some other options.
So at the same time, the U.S. does seem to have the door open for dialogue, and National Security Advisor John Bolton said that President Trump is open to talking to North Korea again. We've heard U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo saying that he wants to send a negotiating team to Pyongyang in the coming weeks. If North Korea does respond, when do you think it will return to the negotiating table, or do you think it still needs some time to review the Hanoi summit?
I think, the U.S. side should fundamentally review what they had experienced back in Hanoi. Especially regarding the North Korean position. We have to understand that the two sides clearly have very serious differences. North Korea doesn't want to give up more than Yeongbyon when it comes to complete denuclearization of its own country. The United States is not willing to budge in terms of lifting any of the sanctions measures before North Korea commits to a serious denuclearization roadmap. So we have a very fundamental difference between the two. So I think North Korea, if they're exploring options right now, probably they're exploring options of how to change this framework of dialogue from one about North Korea denuclearizing or to something about that, it's all about lifting sanctions right away. So I think we have to go through a little bit more of I would say a little bit of a stand-up between the two until this situation is resolved. So I think what the American side is talking about right now, continuing the talks, probably it's not realistic because I don't think the North Koreans are happy with continuing the dialogue the way it is.
But a sticking point at the moment is the fact that U.S. monitors say that North Korea's missile engine test site appears to have been rebuilt following the breakdown of the Hanoi summit last week. Now, President Trump keeps continuing to say that he would be very disappointed if the reports are confirmed to be true. Now, if North Korea is indeed bringing back the test site into operation, what do you think its intentions are?
Clearly, it's a way to signal their displeasure at how the dialogue was going before the Hanoi summit, of course, including what happened in Hanoi. But then, when it comes to reading signals or reading signs of North Korea deviating from the path of dialogue towards something more sinister, such as restarting the provocation cycle, I think the jury is still out on that. So we have to, I think there's some optimism that North Korea might stay on the path of dialogue, but then we have to be a little bit worried about not reaching out to North Korea at this moment.
So would you say it gives North Korea a little bit more leverage?
Definitely. I think North Korea is trying to signal to the rest of the world that the breakdown of dialogue is not really their fault.
How much of a meaningful impact do you think it will have on the denuclearization talks going forward between Washington and Pyongyang?
I think this is the fundamental inflection point from my point of view. The things cannot be the same as before. I think the United States, if they wants to continue the dialogue in the positive direction, which could lead to a constructive outcome, I think the United States should rethink about their approach now.
So Seoul and Washington kicked off their annual joint military drills earlier this week. Now it's the scaled-down version, 동맹, known as Alliance in English. Now the North State media denounced the exercise, saying that it's a violation of joint summit agreements between with Washington and Seoul. However, they are much smaller in scale, and the two allies said that they want to reduce tensions through this and keep the momentum going for dialogue. What's your take on this?
So clearly the United States and South Korea scaled down the joint military exercise by eliminating the offensive component on their exercise. The leftover exercise component called 동맹 is essentially about the defense of the South Korea in case of contingency. So what this North Korean reaction, actually, I would say it's a positioning on the part of North Korea. Just as rebuilding the Dongchang-ri missile test site for further testing, this criticism in a way positions North Korea to essentially defend themselves or like justify their provocation if they are going to carry out a provocation, such as by launching a missile. So if they launch a missile, they can say this is in response to the continuation of the U.S. and South Korean joint military exercise against the agreement that the two sides had reached before.
So in the meantime, South Korea and the U.S. are stepping up efforts to keep the momentum going on with dialogue. We saw South Korea's top nuclear envoy Lee Do-hun meet with his U.S. counterpart Stephen Biegun, and there's also a meeting in the works between U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Seoul's Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa. Now, Seoul also wants to use inter-Korean projects as a means to get these talks going back on track, but U.S. obviously isn't too positive about it. Do you think the two sides are very far apart on this issue?
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental difference in reading the signals coming from North Korea. As I mentioned previously, I think the South Korean government is right to think that the breakdown of Hanoi talks is actually a reflection of a deeper difference between Pyongyang and Washington. So I think there's some concern in Seoul that North Korea might disengage from dialogue unless we put on the table sufficient incentives, which the United States refused to do. I think South Korea essentially is taking the role of providing incentives, providing the carrots, so to speak. And I think that's a different approach from the American approach. And that's the reason why I think the two sides, meaning South Korea and the United States this time, to resolve their differences in policy positions. I think it's going to be very important.
So Seoul's presidential office says it will review the possibility of reopening the joint Kaesong industrial complex in North Korea under the UN sanctions framework, and it will seek consultations with Washington. Now, it has named a new cabinet minister, and obviously for a new unification minister as well, Quymn. Do you think it's an indication of the president's growing focus on inter-Korean relations? Do you believe he's the right man for the job?
Well, the new unification minister, Kim Yeon-chul, is definitely a very good North Korea specialist, and he understands North Korea well. He has a long experience dealing with North Korea, going back to the Nominates president's days almost 15 years ago. So in that sense, he's really well suited for the job. But then we have to also understand that I think President Moon appointed him having in mind restarting actually expanding the scope of inter-Korean exchange projects. So there's a little bit of mismatch between his intention and the timing. Timing indicates that we might actually face tougher times in engaging North Korea economically because of the remaining sanctions. So I think it's going to be Dr. Kim's challenge to how to resolve the situation.
Yes, the U.S. does seem to be firm on its stance towards sanctions. Shifting gears to North Korea's documentary film on the Kim-Trump summit. Now, the film showed scenes that we hadn't seen before in the conventional media. Included footages of the moments that the two leaders wrapped up their summit. We saw Trump patting Kim on the shoulder, and also Trump offering a handshake to North Korean officials, including Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho and nuclear negotiator Kim Yong-chul. What did you make of the overall atmosphere of the film?
Oh, it's very cordial. It looked like the two sides got along. It would be difficult to believe that right after the movie, recording the scene, the whole talks broke down. So this is essentially a spin job by the North Korean regime for internal purposes. They want to show that the United States and North Korea, incredibly enough, they are talking to each other despite their differences. I think that's the message they are trying to inculcate in the North Korean public.
So like North Korean media, the film made no mention of the talks breaking down either, no criticisms of the U.S., and spun the meeting in a positive light. Now, the film said the two countries can write a new history if they engage in negotiations with fair proposal, appropriate attitude, and will to solve the problem. What did you make of this?
Well, definitely that's a truism. I mean, I think we all agree that if either side changes attitude, we can have a new chapter in our history. Whether that's going to be possible or not, we have to see the content of the agreement. So, I mean, this is a typical, as I mentioned before, it's a spin job. Essentially, I think the North Korean regime tries to make something out of what happened in Hanoi. It was actually lemon, but trying to make a lemonade out of it, I would say.
So the documentary also shows footages of U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. Now, in the past, North Korea has harshly criticized the advisor, using harsh words to describe him, but now they've pointed to some have pointed to John Bolton for the breakdown in the talks. But looking at the footage, it's actually hard to tell. What's your take on this?
Well, clearly we have to wait and see whether North Korea keeps addressing John Bolton as John Bolton instead of calling names. So I think that this is just one data point in the long line of data points that we need to discern a pattern out of it.
Now, according to a CNN report, North Korea was desperate for a deal in Hanoi, and after Trump decided to walk away, there are reports saying that North Korean officials chased him back. Now, citing unnamed U.S. officials, the CNN said that North Korean Vice Foreign Minister, Choi Sun-hee, had run after the U.S. delegation with an offer from Kim Jong-un to dismantle the entire Yongbyon nuclear facility in exchange for sanctions relief, but the U.S. didn't take. Does this mean that in the future, North Korea will have to offer more than the Yongbyon nuclear complex?
So we have to understand what the variable was in this case. I mean, the most important variable here was the lifting of the sanctions. And then North Korea was asking for a total, complete lifting of the sanctions. And I think the United States negotiation team was operating under that framework. What would the United States ask from North Korea in exchange for a total, complete lifting of the sanctions? So what North Korea put on the table was just Yongbyon. And the United States was saying that that's not enough, I mean, they needed more. In this case, a number of undisclosed nuclear facilities. So this is where they're fighting over. Essentially, the price was actually zero. It's a complete lifting of the sanctions. The North Korea and the United States were arguing over this. So had North Korea, had Choi Sun-hee gone after the U.S. team with a better offer, so instead of, they could have put the Yongbyon on the table, but instead of asking for a complete lifting of the sanctions, Choi Sun-hee could have asked for something less. Partial lifting of the sanctions. I think the United States could have been game with that kind of offer. But the thing is that they have to operate on this assumption that North Korea would only agree to some sort of agreement if the United States lifted all the sanctions. Then what will be the demand on the part of the United States in exchange for that? I think that was a fundamental disagreement that two sides had.
So you think when North Korea does in fact return to the negotiating table with Washington, it will make some adjustments to the concessions or demands that it makes to Washington?
I'm afraid that they are not going to do that. I think a Yongbyon is going to be their limit. There could be a minor variation on Yongbyon. Clearly, North Koreans play with the idea of defining what Yongbyon is. The Yongbyon is a huge, sprawling complex. So there are some indications that North Korea wanted to play with the definition, meaning for them, the Yongbyon was pertaining to a small number of facilities within it, whereas it's a much bigger complex. So they could play with the definition, but I think a Yongbyon is going to be the one that they're going to stick to for a while.
If they don't make any modification to the cards that they're playing, doesn't it mean that we can see a similar breakdown in the future negotiations as well, though?
So that's the fear that we have. I mean, especially with the movements we're observing in Dongchangli and then as other missile development sites. Clearly, there are some more concerns that back in 2017, when North Korea stopped their provocation cycle, that North Korea, and then they declared that they had to wrap up their nuclear development. There's a lot of skepticism about the claim because people knew that the North Korea needed to develop their missile side. So clearly they are taking out what they left off before. So there's also concern that this could be a major inflection point for the negative.
Yeah, so we'll have to keep close tabs on the developments as well, including its missile launch site as well. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for your insights.
Pleasure.
And that's where we wrap things up today. Join us again at the same time on Monday. Thank you for watching and have a great weekend. Goodbye.
On April 1st, 1919, people gathered at Aulne Market for Korean independence. Here, there was a girl who led a huge crowd and shouted for Korean independence. 17 years old, her name is Yu Kwan-sun. March 1st, 1919 was the day that changed her life. She climbed over the back school fence and walked up to the streets, shouting her head off for independence. Her firm determination for independence after the March 1st independence led Yu Kwan-sun to Aulne Market on April 1st. She was willing to call for Korean independence in front of the crowd. Thus, she lost her parents in front of her eyes and was locked up in prison, but her desire for independence never stopped even in prison. In 1920, at the age of 18, she died due to severe torture but shouted Korean independence. Power that beat gender and age made her forget fear. It must have been an eternal love for the country beating in her heart.